It's time for another episode of the Global Meditation Podcast. This weekly show features explorations of spiritual and paranormal topics with a focus on bridging the physical and metaphysical, bringing deeper meaning to our individual and collective lives. And now here's your host, Darby Miller.
Hello and welcome to the Global Meditation Podcast. This is episode 23. My name is Darby Miller, and in this episode we have Matthew Roberts back for another interview. In our last two podcast episodes, we had an interview with Matthew Roberts that we broke into two parts, where he discussed his experiences that started happening to him after he was stationed aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. In 2015, there was videos of UAPs, otherwise known as UFOs, that were recorded and subsequently acknowledged by the Navy as being authentic and that they didn't know what these flying objects were. This is referred to as the go fast and gimbal footage. Matthew Roberts was aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt at this time. Subsequently, he transferred to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. I think that was about a year later, and he started having visitations and other experiences that he believes were related to these initial UAP sightings. And Matthew, because of these experiences, he went through a very dark psychological time where he was near suicide. He found his way out the other side, had what you could definitely consider to be a spiritual awakening, and now he's written a book which is entitled Initiated: UAP, Dreams, Depression, Delusions, Shadow People, Psychosis, Sleep Paralysis, and Pandemics. You can find Matthew's book at Amazon.com in both Kindle and paperback versions. I invited Matthew back for a second interview to specifically discuss the psychological and spiritual meaning behind the UAP phenomenon. I think that having conversations with UAP experiencers like Matthew, who have gone through the dark night of the soul as a result of this contact with the UAP phenomenon, and then come out the other side, is very important to get their perspectives as far as what is actually going on with UAPs/UFOs. Matthew, in this interview, talks some more about what he understands to be the psychological and spiritual underpinnings of the phenomenon. He talks more about Stoicism, integrating your archetypes, and the seasonal cycles of initiation, which are reflected in the Greek mystery schools. We also talk a little bit more about some of Matthew's experiences with these entities. So with that, I'll go ahead and transition over to the recorded interview. I hope you enjoy it. Matthew, thanks so much for coming on to the podcast with me again. This is our second interview. During our first interview, you went through some of the main experiences that you had related to the UAP encounter that was filmed in 2015 aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. You went through some of your experiences and visitations and talked a bit about the consciousness revelations you had toward the tail end of this. And you have a lot to say, I think, about the psychological and spiritual meaning behind the UAP or UFO phenomenon. And I wanted to dedicate a whole episode to talking about this. To start off, what would you say, what do you think the most important thing that the governments or UFO researchers or UFO UAP experiencers should maybe be considering or starting to look at when it comes to perhaps the deeper meaning behind the UAP experience? How do we get behind the nuts and bolts kind of stuff? What do you think people should be looking at?
Well, I think ultimately this is a mystery that you're not going to understand just looking at the nuts and bolts of this. And I think that it's not going to be completely understood unless you start talking to experiencers, right? People who have had direct contact with the phenomenon. And that's not to say that all of those people are interpreting their experiences correctly, or that any one of us is right about what has happened to us. But it's going to give you a clearer picture of kind of the broad goings on of the phenomenon and what it's up to, what it's been doing. Something that I talk about in my book is that this has been going on for a very long time. And I think that it would shock people to know that this goes back possibly hundreds of thousands of years, if not longer, in human history. So, I mean, that's a big shocker, because not all of us experience these things. Not all of us see these things. There are still a lot of people out there that think all of this is nonsense, and I am on Twitter. I often will kind of voice my disappointment in government processes when it comes to disclosure, because we're never going to understand this if it's just kept secret and only a handful of people have any kind of knowledge as to what's going on. That we'll never understand it that way. But all of us together, we can all of us take a look at this and step back and kind of just let's start dissecting it. I mean, that's what I did. And I kind of found out that, everything is already kind of out there, right? There aren't any secrets. I mean, people have been talking about this forever. They've been talking about experiences forever. And none of that, none of that can be controlled so much by our government, because people can say what they want. I'm obviously talking about what I experienced, and others are too. And so that would be my biggest gripe and my biggest emphasis to governments around the world, that we just need to get this out there. There's no reason to keep it a secret. It's been around forever. It's going to be around forever. You're not going to stop it. So we might as well just figure it out.
What do you think the main reason that isn't happening? Does it have something to do with the deeper meaning behind the UAPs, the whole initiatory process, or what do you think stopping governments from doing that? I think the biggest thing that stops people in their tracks from talking about this is just that the phenomenon clearly does not acknowledge these structures in our society, right? They're not landing on the White House lawn. They're not landing in front of the Capitol building and going in to talk to Congress, right? They're talking to individuals, and they're shutting the rest of that out. And these are supposed to be the structures in our society that are the authority, right? And so if you're locking out the authority and you have no care in the world for it, I think that's somewhat alarming for the authority, wouldn't you say? Especially if it's something that's so powerful that, it's technology, it's creating a space-time bubble that it rides around in. And it has no respect for your authority. So I think that kind of throws them off a bit. So it's a power thing, possible loss of power and control, and
yeah, they don't control it, and so I think that's a big reason why and it doesn't even acknowledge those structures, as far as we can tell, and that's how little it thinks of them. So I don't know. Maybe it's kind of like, well, if you're not going to acknowledge us, we're not going to acknowledge you. type of thing. I don't know. I mean, honestly, in my opinion, there's no reason to keep this a secret, obviously. I think that throughout history, people have had their own reasons as to why they've done that. I don't know what the latest reasoning is with our government. I'm not even sure. I honestly, a lot of people have had me try and guess. I don't know. I mean, it's just, to me, it's nonsense and it's silly, and we need to stop it.
Right. Well, I almost wonder if it really even matters. I would like to see it happen from a technological perspective, if it could benefit people with something like, let's say, free energy, right?
Oh, yeah.
People could be released from the day-to-day toil and struggle just to survive, so they would have more time to engage in more reflection or spiritual or artistic pursuits, things that actually elevate the human condition. So I think from a technological perspective, how the acknowledgement of, yes, we've recovered craft, or these craft or relationships with other groups exist, and let's get this technology out there. But on the other hand, I think I got from your book is it almost doesn't matter in a way in terms of the other side of the UAP phenomenon, which is the spiritual initiatory side. There's nothing stopping a government acknowledging it or not isn't going to stop someone from engaging in their own spiritual journey, and that the UAP phenomenon is sort of a prodding for people to look at that side of their lives, and it doesn't really matter if the government's going to acknowledge it or not from that perspective.
Right. Yeah. And, the argument could also be made that none of this has ever been a secret, right? Because all of this is out there. Everything is out there. The government just isn't acknowledging it as fact. But the truth is out there. I mean, and if people choose not to look at it, well, that's kind of an individual choice, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So there's that side of it too. I mean, the phenomenon doesn't necessarily hide from anyone. If you want engagement, I feel like it probably would give it to you if you were serious about it. But most people just aren't serious about it, and I don't know, they think this is some kind of game, maybe, or something to play with, and it is not that. It is not that at all. You have to be serious about this, and you have to want to engage. And you should only do so if you are ready for your life to be turned upside down and possibly ruined. I mean, it's not an easy ride. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's another reason why it's kept a secret, because it's just not easy for people. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that really bothers me about this secret, right, and the government not acknowledging it, is that, because it's not an easy ride, you don't have anyone to talk to about this, right? You don't, because there's this stigma around it. Just last night I was in a Twitter space, and there were some vets in there talking about their experiences. And one of them, suffering from PTSD, was talking to his psychologist at the VA, right? And they were trying to get things out of him, like, tell us about your most traumatic experience. What was it? Was it on the battlefield? Was it, what was it? And so he says, well, let's start with UFOs. And they started laughing at him, right? Because this topic is not taken seriously. Mm-hmm. And so if you can't talk to your psychologist or your psychiatrist about this and be taken seriously, then what good is psychology? Mm-hmm. What good is that whole study It's worthless. If you have to lie to them to get treatment, I mean, how well are they really treating you if they don't know everything? Mm-hmm. And they laugh at you for something that has happened to you.
Right.
And the thing that really bothers me about that is that because of my book being out there and the fact that I do take this seriously, I'll have people contact me every season. You know, some of them are suicidal when they contact me. Some of them have just been diagnosed with schizophrenia and serious mental illness like that. And yet I can work with them for a few months and they're fine. You know, but you go to a psychologist, they're going to put you on all kinds of brain altering chemical drugs that are just going to wreak havoc on your brain, and you will be crazy by the time they're done with you, because they're going to tell you this is not real. You're living in Alice in Wonderland or something. You know, you need to take all these drugs, this cocktail of drugs, and then you'll be somewhat normal. And that's just not the truth. It's not the truth. And the worst part about it is that because all of this is out there and we know what the truth is, right? So does the government. And yet they are A-okay with the fact that there are vets, not even vets, people in the general public that are being misdiagnosed with these serious mental illnesses that they are not sick with. They're given powerful antipsychotic drugs that alter their brains, and they're okay with that. They're okay with that to hide the truth. And that to me is criminal. It's criminal. I'll say that. I don't really care. You can come after me, come knocking on my door. I don't really give a shit. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. This is ridiculous, and it needs to end. There are people out there, I'm sure, right now, who are fully aware of all of this stuff going on, and they're collecting a pension because they've retired. And their whole career, they have been okay with the fact that if you go to a psychiatrist and talk about this stuff, certain things are going to happen, and none of them are good. Being diagnosed with these things can ruin your career. If you're a pilot, certainly it's going to ruin your career. And yet this has just been okay. There's no problem, you know, and that's the worst part of it.
Right. Well, maybe your book and books and resources like it can be part of the tipping point. Maybe it can come from both ends, you know, a government acknowledging just the bare facts of, you know, that UAPs are real and the nuts and bolts side of things. And then you approaching it from a different angle. Maybe eventually they'll meet and there'll be a tipping point, one would hope. Mm-hmm. You mentioned prior to starting the recording that you were aware of just recently a couple of other resources that were talking about UAPs and initiation. You want to share? I want to look further into those resources. What were a couple of those resources you mentioned?
Yeah. So one thing I mentioned was Jim Semivan, who was an ex-CIA officer. He talks about this being an initiatory experience. That was on another podcast that I had listened to. And he talks about the difficulty of that. You know, that it's very difficult for people to, especially if they've never been in any kind of initiatory experience, to then suddenly be thrust into this. And you have no perspective on it. So it's very difficult to kind of put things together. And then another resources, of course, I've seen on Twitter, Dr. Diana Pasulka, the author of American Cosmic, is putting together this class on initiation. which I think is
that in
and
the context of UAPs specifically, or
she's a professor of religious studies. I believe that it is in the context of UAP because she's posting it on UFO Twitter, so
right.
I would imagine that would be the context in which she's teaching this. I don't know what the class's content is, obviously, because I haven't sat through it. I don't know, but I mean, this just goes to show that I'm not the only one who thinks this. That these are initiatory experiences with these UAP and with contact.
Okay. Well, let's talk about this word then. It's the title of your book, Initiation. And what is an initiatory experience, and how does it relate to the UAP phenomenon?
Well, so I've been in initiatory experience before, right? I went to boot camp, and boot camp is an initiatory experience, right? It's something that will condition your mind to think a certain way, right? And whatever the goal of that certain way to think is, whether it's like you're being initiated into an organization and they want you to be loyal to them, so they put you through all of these kind of trust things where they never let you fall, and it's very difficult, but you end up trusting them with your very life. That would be kind of an initiatory thing. And so that's I just kind of recognized that was what was happening within this process that I went through, and that is in fact one of the base core kind of structures within religion, is this whole idea of a death and a resurrection, right? Because within an initiatory experience, you start out as one thing, and then you go through these trials and tribulations, and you come out of it changed. You're something else after that. You're something more, hopefully something more, but that's not always the case, obviously. And so that's kind of how I would define that. And I will say this too, that Joseph Campbell, who was all about mythology, and everything he wrote was about mythology, but he came up with this kind of comparing mythologies and religions throughout the world, that there were these common themes. And he called it the hero's journey. And that is a common theme and a common thread through absolutely everything, right? Like all ancient stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the labors of Hercules. It's all the hero's journey, right? There are these certain steps that happen along this journey. And it's the oldest story ever told. And Hollywood got a hold of this, right? Hollywood got a hold of this. And now, like any kind of blockbuster movie is going to be based on the hero's journey. They discovered that this is something that sells. And it sells because we all know that we have to take this journey. We all know it. It's kind of subconsciously, we know that this is coming. And so it speaks to us on that level. It speaks to us on that subconscious level. And we come out of that movie thinking, oh, wow, that was such a great movie. But we can't really put our fingers on why that was such a great movie. And it's because it's based on the hero's journey by Joseph Campbell.
What just occurred to me, I'm wearing a Matrix t-shirt. And of course, Neo.
Yeah, exactly.
He goes through this initiatory process, right? He's broken down, and then comes to realize that he's a part of a matrix, and he overcomes the programming and can suddenly he rises above it. Right, comes out the other side. So does every individual on a hero's journey, they go through a process of initiation as a part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the initiatory process is, right? It's a tearing down and then a building back up on the other side. And, this isn't, you can see this process happening in nature, even. Right? We have the seasons of the year, right? We have spring when everything blossoms and blooms, but then it goes through this change and it dies, and then it comes back again in the spring. And so we see these processes in nature as well. It's not just, and we're not separable from our surroundings. A lot of people like to think, well, I'm here in my house, and that's nature out there. And that has nothing to do with me. Mm-hmm. But guess what? You're very much a part of nature, and you just kind of need to recognize that.
And that gets into one of the things you talk about in your book, which is that there are seasons of initiation, and they're related to the Eleusinian mysteries, the Greek secret mystery schools, where I suppose in the was it in the winter solstice is when that process would start?
Yeah, it would start usually on the first full moon closest to the autumnal equinox. Okay, that's when it would begin, the mysteries in Greece. And specifically the Eleusinian mysteries, they would begin with this long pilgrimage, this march to from Athens to Eleusis, which is where the temple to the goddess Demeter was, and that was where the rites would take place. Is at the temple, and so even there you see that. You see that this is a process, right? And it's kind of like, it's kind of like, instilling in you that this is a process, it's a journey, because you start off the mysteries by taking this long hike, this journey, down this path. And that's exactly what the mysteries are. It's this path that you can take, which leads you somewhere, ultimately, to a truth about yourself, and so even, the psychology of that and building that into the mysteries as a part of it, I think was also important, an important layer of that process.
Mm-hmm. So you believe now that to this very day, there is a annual season of initiation that starts in the fall, and that if someone is wanting to go through an initiatory process to come out the other side with some type of a heightened level of consciousness or spiritual understanding, that that they can take advantage of these annual cycles. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so, to me, it's kind of very obvious, but to others, maybe not. But you see these cycles in nature, and yet we insist that we are not a part of nature. And so we are not a part of these cycles. We have our heating, our air conditioning that protect us from those cycles, and they don't, we aren't a part of them, but it is built into our DNA. I mean, this is just who we are. And that is when this time of year is the time of year that you can take advantage of that. I mean, there's even in psychology, it's a known phenomenon that people become depressed in the wintertime.
Seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is known. I mean, and to think that we as humans don't go through these same cycles, I think is just ridiculous. I mean,
So if someone's listening and they're thinking, well, I have spiritual practices. I meditate. I have whatever spiritual practice I'm doing to try to uncover more of myself, who I am.
Right.
How would someone consider integrating this concept of a seasonal cycle of initiation into their lives?
Yeah. Well, I honestly, I never really did. I never really thought of it that way until I went through it. But I'll tell you what I did do in my life. And I think ultimately this is where people get really confused, is that we think that spirituality, we have these ideas of what we think spirituality is, right? And I think all of those are wrong. Almost all of them are wrong. I think of spirituality as something that is deeply psychological, right?
Okay.
It's deeply psychological because I in my life, I certainly never had any kind of spiritual practices. I was not a spiritual person.
You are an atheist, I believe.
Yeah, I was a total atheist. I never believed in any of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was all hocus pocus. But that fact alone tells me that we don't really understand what spirituality is, because I was never spiritual, quote unquote, right? I didn't have any kind of practices. But what I did practice was deeply psychological.
Mm-hmm.
I talk a lot about introverts and extroverts. I was very much introverted. And something that I realized after this is that I was also a Stoic. That was not a thing that was known to me. It wasn't a practice that I had put in place in my life. I realized that I have emotions, right? And I need to control those because those are under my control, and I can, so I should. And so that's what I sought out to do with my life. I wanted to be very much in control of myself, my thoughts, my emotions. And to me, that was what it was all about. I practiced Stoicism without even knowing that it was a thing or that it was a philosophy. It was only something that I looked into afterwards, and I was like, oh, wow, that's what I've kind of always done. I've always kind of just tried to control those aspects of myself. I was very much not a fan of wearing my emotions as a handle on my back that anybody could grab and just move me with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have certain emotions, people will grab those emotions and they'll move you with them. And I did not like to be moved. I kind of, and it's going to sound awful. I put this in the beginning of my book because I knew it was important. But in the Navy, I was talking to some junior guys, right, that were just new to the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were talking about, the total lack of creature comforts that exist, right? Because you have this little rack, you work like 20 hours a day, and there's no creature comforts, right? And so, I was just kind of giving them advice on how to deal with that and how I had dealt with it. And I told them, if you don't like anything, then nobody can ever take anything from you. And they kind of looked at me like, what?
Yeah.
But it was true. Like, if you don't enjoy anything, nobody can hold that over your head and say, I'm going to keep you from this unless you do what I want,
Well, let's break that down a little bit, because you talk about that concept and Stoicism a lot in your book. And I remember reading a few passages and thinking, boy, this doesn't appeal to me at all. I mean, I want to go out and enjoy a nice dinner with my wife. I want to,
Right.
I like to play video games once in a while. I don't want to be this person who's dead inside, who is
Yeah.
inaccessible to my wife to even to show love or kindness or whatever. And I don't think that's what you're saying, but sometimes it's hard to get through to really understanding what you're
Yeah.
meaning
Right.
behind that.
And what I am meaning is that I didn't like that people could hold those things over me. And so I would talk myself out of them, and I would say, well, I don't need that. I mean, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that that then meant that I hated everything, right? And I was just this ball of hate that just kind of rolled around the ship. That's not what I was. It was more like I knew that I could do without if I had to, right? And so if someone said, well, I've got this thing you really like, and if you don't do what I want, you can't have it. That was not a big deal for me, because I was like, well, screw you. I don't need it.
Right. It sounds like we're talking about codependence. So the idea that you talk a lot about archetypes and shadow archetypes, and it sounds like what you're talking about is taking the shadow archetype, this disowned aspect of yourself that you're projecting on someone or something, and bringing it in and becoming more complete within yourself, which is what you talk about in your book, and therefore you don't necessarily need someone or something. You might enjoy it. I mean, imagine you have things that you enjoy doing. You don't walk around in a robotic state.
No, not at all. And that's kind of the it's really kind of an exact science, right? I mean, getting to that point, because a lot of people just will go with their every emotion, right? They will go wherever their emotions take them. And those are the people in our society that are the most out of control. Those are the people who are in prison right now, right? Because they follow their every emotion, and they're ruled by their emotions rather than ruling their emotions. Mm-hmm. It's just the other way around. And so through the practice of Stoicism, that's what I was doing. But unbeknownst to me, right, at the same time, in practicing Stoicism, what you're doing is you're becoming more introverted. And I talk a lot about introverts and extroverts, and about how these aren't just simple personality traits. These are two different ways of perceiving reality. Mm-hmm. Right. And what I mean by that is a lot of people don't know what an introvert and extrovert means. They think, oh, it's, an extrovert is someone who's really outgoing, and an introvert is somebody who sits at home and reads books all day. That's not what it's about. Mm-hmm. The introvert, right, understands their thoughts, their emotions, and they understand that those things are their own and that they can control those, right? And the extrovert does not view reality that way. What they think is that all of those things lie outside of myself, right? That you are the source of my irritation or my anger or the fact that I don't have a job, that's your fault. But they will project, instead of internalizing those and saying those are mine and I own them, and taking ownership of them, they project them on the world out there, right? And so by extension, something like a spouse will become an extension of yourself, right? And so when you're trying to control your emotions as an extrovert, you are setting out to physically control the world out there, because you don't understand that, no, your emotions are yours, and that is not the source of your emotion out there. But they don't see it that way, right? So they will control everyone and everything in their immediate sphere in an effort to get their mind under control. Mm-hmm. And that anything else beyond that is complete chaos. Complete chaos, right? And you can see that these people they're highly susceptible to conspiracy theories. They're susceptible to all kinds of things when that starts to happen. These are often people who will collect guns, for instance, because they need to keep that chaos out there at bay so that it doesn't come in here. It doesn't come into my sphere and my mind. Mm-hmm. But you see this too with people who get attached to material things, right? Like maybe some kind of classic car that becomes an extension of yourself in some archetypal way. So if someone were to scratch it or dent it, God forbid, you just hurt me. You hurt this aspect of myself, and I am highly offended by that. Mm-hmm. And you are the source of all of that. Mm-hmm. And that's just not the truth of it. That's not reality. Mm-hmm. Right? And so people, when they are more extroverted, they are incapable of viewing or perceiving actual reality. Mm-hmm. What they're perceiving is themselves on the world out there. And that's not what the world is. The world is not an extension of you and your emotions. And so they get it flipped around. And that's why, when some people talking about this UFO subject, they will say that in order to understand it, you have to change your perception of reality. And that's what they're talking about, changing your perception from an extrovert to an introvert. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I can kind of see that makes sense, because every kind of interaction I've ever had where they've said something to me, it was always telepathic, right? And where would that originate other than within? Mm-hmm. Right? And so that would be an introverted quality, that they're able to, from within themselves, communicate to the within of you without moving their lips, right? So there, once you do this and you can see reality for what it is, rather than what you have incorrectly perceived it to be, everything changes. And then things become clear and very obvious. And they certainly did for me.
So it's important to engage in an initiatory experience and come out the other side with the transformation that we're all longing for on a deep level, that one, in the areas where we are acting in a more extroverted way, mm-hmm. and we're making things about the outside versus the inside, that we engage in some type of a practice to reclaim these disowned aspects or projections of ourselves. And one way to do that is through the practice of Stoicism. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Stoicism for a second, because I think most people think that Stoicism is basically cramming your emotions down into some kind of a deep, dark hole where they're out of sight, out of mind. And of course, when we think of somebody like that, they're kind of like a walking time bomb, either emotionally or physically. We think of someone repressing emotions and getting sick with heart attack or cancer or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's not what you're talking about. Can you contrast that idea of Stoicism with your understanding of what Stoicism is in practice?
Yeah. So, a lot of people don't practice Stoicism correctly. And because of that, Stoicism has kind of this bad rap, because people incorrectly think that Stoicism is just bottling up your emotions, right? So instead of like, so you're still experiencing those emotions in bottling them up. You just don't react and you keep it all inside. And that's not what Stoicism is. Stoicism is hopefully preventing you from having that emotion to begin with, right? Because you've thought about these things, right? You've thought about how, no, I control my anger. It's up to me how angry I get. And so I'm going to choose that I'm not going to get angry about this. And it's just going to be what it is. And that is kind of what I did. I didn't like being ruled by emotions. So I decided that I wasn't going to go there at all. Right. And this is not an easy thing to do. It takes some work and some thought. And some, in my book, I use some examples of things that, Marcus Aurelius, he wrote the Meditations, which is just kind of like these Stoic, and this is the Meditations is a big, kind of example of Stoicism. And one of the things he was a Roman emperor, and he talks about, well, what's the difference between some simple stool, right, made out of wood that sits in the corner or maybe in a poor person's house, and my throne? What's the difference? And he kind of contemplates, well, what is the difference between that? And he comes to the conclusion that there is no difference. They both serve the same purpose. One is just covered in fabric, and so somehow it's more special. Right? What does that mean? It's nonsense. It means nothing. What matters is the function. And so you see this in society too, where people get attached to cars. I want a Mercedes. I want a BMW, vice driving something more cheap and economical and useful. But people don't do that. They don't stop to think about these things. Well, what does that really mean? Because at the end of the day, what you're going to find is that it doesn't mean anything, and you don't need that Mercedes. And in fact, you could probably come up with a bunch of reasons why you don't need it. It may be too expensive, so you're going to have this high car payment. You're going to have high insurance rates. That's going to mean less trips to the movies or doing whatever you like doing. And so, is it really that important? Probably not, And so that's kind of what Stoicism is about. It's about just kind of thinking these things through, rather than reacting. And that, like I said, that takes work. So, like when you start feeling an emotion and you don't want it, you need to start thinking about it. Start thinking about, well, why am I feeling this? And is it really that useful? And I can think back, I've been doing this for a very long time. Before I even joined the Navy, I had a job that was kind of stressful, and we did marketing research for movie studios, right? And so we'd show like a movie to a test audience type of thing. And it was just very stressful. And so I was in the office one day, and we had this project going out with these surveys, and my boss was standing there, and it was coming down to the wire, right? The guy was at the door, the delivery guy, to take this stuff to the airport. And we were coming up against the deadline because it had to go out to LA that night. So my boss is standing in the middle of the room, and she starts crying. And I was like, Kelly, standing there crying is not going to get this project out the door. You've got to keep it together, you know? And so that's a perfect example of how emotion can just kind of get in the way of everyday life and get in the way of accomplishing things, because you just become paralyzed by it, you know, and you just end up standing in the middle of the room crying, and that, at the end of the day, that's not going to help you.
So the key is not to let emotions rule you. If you find yourself feeling an emotion that maybe you're feeling triggered, that you have the use your will to say, I want to look at this different, and engage in some type of cognitive deconstructive process to really look. And at the end of the day, it sounds like what you're doing is finding a new meaning for whatever is behind the emotion that diffuses it. So you get to the point where, as you said, you're not feeling it at all if it's something that isn't serving you.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect definition of it. I wish I had just said that.
I'm thinking back, as you know, I'm into the Law of One material, which is a body of channeled work that was came through in the 80s by LL Research. And I remember a question that the Don Elkins, who was the primary questioner in that material, asking the group of entities that go by Ra. And they give a very similar answer. Don proposes that what Ra is talking about in terms of how to constructively work with emotions is that if something comes up, which they call catalyst, you allow yourself to experience the catalyst and let it move through you, and that's sort of the pinnacle of what someone who is dealing with emotions in a healthy way can achieve. And Ra says no. The pinnacle is you don't experience the catalyst at all, the emotion, at all. And
right. You know, and I will say that in analyzing this whole introverts and extroverts thing, if other people out there are pissing you off, right? One of the ways you can look at it is, well, that person's just an extrovert, right? And they're not thinking about this stuff. And so why should I even care what they think or that they flip me off on the road? You know, who are they? Who cares?
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, because I think what we do is when we have an experience with someone like that who seems to be brusque or so unconscious that they're behaving in a hurtful way to us, that we take it personally, and we take it into our own internal landscape and say, well, that means something about me. Whereas what you're saying is, no, it doesn't mean anything about you. Don't take that whatever they're doing and bring it inside and create some kind of internal meaning about your own lack of worth or whatever.
Yeah.
They're not aware of it at all.
Right.
They're just out there a pinball bouncing to and fro.
Right. They're just, they're a slave to their emotions is how you can look at it. And, when I see people doing that and when I see that, I always think to myself, oh my gosh, thank God I am not a slave to my emotions, because that's what that looks like. And you look foolish, Yeah. But so if you want to put all of this Stoicism and stuff together with, and kind of these psychological concepts, and you want to put them together with archetypal ideas, one of the things I was talking to someone recently about, because we were talking about all these shootings, right? These mass shootings, and they know that I talk about the psychological stuff. And so they said, well, what does that mean? Well, what's happening there? And I think that our problem as a society is that we look at things like that and incidences like that, and we want to like intellectualize it in some way, right? We want to find some intellectual reason that this is happening. Maybe the person grew up poor, maybe so they have something against society. I don't know, whatever the case may be. We try to intellectualize these things, and these things are not intellectual acts. They're psychological acts, right? Because within this process that we all know we have to undergo, the introvert will internalize that. For the extrovert, it plays out in the physical world because they project it on the world out there, right? So the introvert will realize, I have these emotions and these thoughts, and I need to just crush them and squash them and make them go away. I need to kill them out, right? But if you are projecting this process on the world out there, it's very easy to see how someone would become like a mass shooter, right? They're projecting all of this archetypal energy on the world out there. And there are these internal things that need to be destroyed, and I'm destroying them in the world out there. So the thing that I always tell people is that the extrovert destroys the world. The introvert builds it. Mm-hmm. And those two things are totally different.
And they build could you say the introvert builds an internal world, which then is reflected on the external world. To create the kind of world we want, we need people that are looking inwards and they're getting their internal house in order, so to speak. And because of how the inside then reflects on the outside, we'll see the kind of world that we want to live in.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, completely. And, and that speaks to some of these experiences we have that kind of allegorically speak to those ideas, and these psychological concepts. Like in my room at night, I saw the blue entity, and the room lit up, right, in this golden light. The room was completely dark, and then all of a sudden it lit up behind this entity, right? And that's just kind of like, allegorically speaking, what you're looking at is like this idea that some divine entity can become the light of the world, right? So when you're introverted, you are becoming what you want, and you project that out rather than projecting these shadow aspects of yourself out on the world out there. So you in that sense, you become the light of the world, right? You become that beacon of light for people, seeking illumination, shedding light on things that people didn't understand, or don't understand. And that's kind of the allegory there. The
allegory of the entity that was in your room with the light coming off the top of her head.
Yeah, and I mean, ancient cultures have taken this allegory too, and placed it in the sky, right, in constellations, and that's why we have the signs of the zodiac, right, because those constellations will eclipse. Or the sun eclipses those constellations at certain times of the year. And, our mythological stories talk about how these gods or whatever that are associated with these constellations become the light of the world, right? When they're in the path of the sun, and, it's illumination. It's shedding light on the darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have a pretty lengthy section where you do a deep dive on the constellations.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe that was too much, but I find it personally just very intriguing. And I and I had come to this conclusion in reading the book of Revelation that it was talking about the time of year that initiation happens, and it was using, and the imagery in it were constellations in the sky. And I had come to that conclusion just looking at it, kind of a cursory look. But then in digging into that a little bit, I found that there were earlier Christian sects that also thought that the book of Revelations was kind of an astronomical clock, and they kind of followed that idea. But in the research I did, people were kind of like, well, we don't really know what that means. But really, you read the book of Revelations, and it, on its face, it's nonsense. It doesn't seem to be talking about anything. But then when you kind of realize that everything in there is representative of a constellation and the path of the sun through the sky, then it starts to make sense, because you can kind of place it into the autumnal equinox. You can place it like the first thing that is seen in the book of Revelations, right, is this guy, and he's wearing this golden girdle. And there's this throne, right? And that's clearly, to me, that's a representation of the constellation Orion. And many ancient cultures would kind of look at Orion's belt, because Orion's belt would rise in the night sky on the horizon at the exact point that the sun would rise on the equinoxes. So I always thought that was kind of interesting.
So it's the idea that historical writings about constellations, that either reference the constellations directly or perhaps in a more veiled way.
Yeah.
That the position of these constellations line up with the seasons of initiation in some way, and that we can see this as a kind of a working system internally and externally that's kind of signposts pointing us towards a pathway we can follow. Is that the general idea with the constellations?
Yeah, I think so. And it was written kind of in a very esoteric way, so that you would never obviously get that out of the book unless you knew what you were reading.
Right.
So I always thought that was kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about Stoicism and the idea that one ultimately wants to get to the point where they are becoming more and more introverted, meaning that you're looking at the source of where your emotional discomforts are coming from, thinking about it, and ultimately releasing them. You could say extinguishing them or killing them. I think I prefer the term that ultimately you release the emotion. It sort of unravels, and whatever not of meaning that you ascribe to it, some kind of a false or harmful or inaccurate belief, through the process of Stoicism, thinking about it, that this illusory knot of misplaced meaning unravels, and with this unraveling of false meaning, the emotion releases.
Yeah.
And that we are doing this to ultimately, I'm gathering from your book, be more and more ripe for the process of initiation. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I had got to the point in my life that I I didn't experience like high highs or low lows. I preferred to be kind of right in the middle. And I liked to be in no mood at all. Right. I wasn't someone that I've got to constantly make myself happy, because that takes too much work, too much effort. But it also takes too much work and effort to be constantly angry. So I like to just walk this, center line where I was none of those things.
Could you call that to simply being in a state of being and
yeah.
being in the present moment?
Yeah, I think it is. And I worked very hard to stay there, usually. Despite, anything that was going on around me. Because I recognized that kind of that stability is what I liked. I liked that stability, that emotional and mental stability. And I think that was what ultimately made me ripe for this experience.
And how does it, do you think, make us ready to go through an initiatory experience where we are ushered into a painful deconstruction process, what you've described as the hero's journey, and we hopefully make our way through that to come out the other side with some type of knowledge or illumination? Why does this process of releasing or extinguishing our emotions and becoming introverted and walking this path of emotional neutrality make us ready for that, do you think?
This kind of goes back to what I talk about with positive personality disintegration. So everything that we've been talking about just now is a part of positive personality disintegration. Mm-hmm. And I think that when you have shown a proclivity or that you're capable of doing this positive personality disintegration, that makes you ripe for the experience, because they know that you can achieve something in the end, right? You are capable of going through this. Okay. Because you've demonstrated an ability to do that throughout your
So we're
life.
assuming that then that the process of initiation is always guided, mediated. You are ushered into this process by some type of intelligence. In your case, sometimes this intelligence seems to manifest as actual entities of mm-hmm. different types that would visit you in your room. Is it safe to say that's your understanding, that there is an intelligence, and we might call it extraterrestrials? Perhaps there's other types of intelligences, but they're always a part of the initiatory process?
I would not say that they are always a part of it. I mean, certainly in my case, they were. Mm-hmm. I have talked to other people, though, that never saw anything like that. They never mm-hmm. saw another entity, but they did go through this, right? And
through some kind of dark night of the soul to come out the other side with some type of a knowledge of some type.
Yeah, exactly. And they never had any kind of alien or entity that was a part of the experience, but they went through it nonetheless. And I kind of look at that and I say, well, all of these experiences are kind of tailor-made to whoever's going through it. So I feel like that's what I needed, mm-hmm. right? I needed that extra kick. And others maybe not, and so if it's not necessary, they're not going to do it.
Well, I'm sure that's good news for a lot of listeners who are hungry for spiritual knowledge, interested in this idea of going through a spiritual initiation to have a sense of oneness and that kind of thing, like you experience on the other side, but they're not necessarily interested in being having little creatures visit them at night or being sexually assaulted.
Right.
And let's talk about that for a moment. We talked off the air.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I wonder if people think of when they listen to your story is this guy went through hell.
Yeah.
He was terrorized. He was near suicidal. Like I said, he was sexually assaulted, literally. And now he's written a book where he's viewing this in the spiritual light, and good for him that he's been able to come out of this the other side and have a positive spin on it. But are we dealing with a case of Stockholm syndrome?
Right.
I had asked you if you had ever run across people thinking about that. I think it's a reasonable thought, because most of us, like, we're looking at this on two different levels, right? We talked about this before in the other interview, but if I go and sexually assault somebody and you run into this person I sexually assaulted, you're not going to encourage them to view me as some sort of I don't know, like a shaman who knew what she needed to spiritually grow,
right?
And therefore, I must be a spiritually evolved person. You're going. I think you know what I'm getting at here. So,
yeah, and in reading, some of Dr. Robert Moore's stuff, he does say, and I don't think he emphasizes this point enough, but because this could go a long way in deconstructing cult like behaviors where things like this are they try to introduce things like this, right? And experiences like this to try to get some reaction out of it. But something that Dr. Robert Moore says is that the other entity in this scenario, because of the high level of emotion and the high stakes, that other entity cannot be human. They can't be human. So if you think that you're going to start some kind of rape cult and bring this about, I mean, it's not going to happen, right? Because that's not the intent that you have going into it. And so, yeah, you're not spiritually enlightened doing that kind of behavior, because you're not coming from the right place in your mind.
Right.
And I'm certainly not evolved enough that I would ever get to a point that I would say, oh yeah, I'm comfortable doing that. No, I would never be comfortable with that. And so if any human is telling you that you need to start a sex cult or whatever, just run. I mean, it's nonsense. The person, the other entity in this situation that is kind of going to be a container for this archetypal energy in your own mind cannot be human. It can't be. I mean, there's just no other way to do it. It won't work at all.
So we're talking about, in this example, the blue female entity that you had an experience with.
Right.
So let's talk about that. And one could say, looking at the outside, well, this was a sexual assault. But what you're saying is that this was much more. And it was in an experience that was for you specifically, that someone could look at that and say, well, he's suffering from Stockholm syndrome, or these are evil aliens or whatever.
Right.
But you shared your story, and it was something that happened for you specifically with this female entity. How does what happened between you and this female entity relate to holding an archetype? You mentioned that. What was she doing there, do you think?
So, what I tell people is that everything that we have been talking about so far in terms of psychology and these psychological ideas, when you enter into this initiatory experience, you have to do those things to an extreme. And in society today, it's perfectly okay to go about your day in a stoic kind of way. But if you want to get to the next level, there's going to be some next level stuff you have to get through and put together in your own mind. And so they want you to do that and to exhibit those behaviors and to exhibit that kind of mental control and to take that kind of mental control to an extreme that you never would have otherwise. Because that is what is necessary for this going forward. You have to have that extreme to push you further than you ever would have gone. And that experience with that blue female obviously worked to that end. I was, and I'm going to put this in the context of something that Plato wrote. So he wrote something that I really, really liked, and that is Plato's Symposium. And this is it's just a dialogue between dinner guests. And Plato, of course, wrote it about Socrates, his teacher, who was a guest at this dinner. And they decided at this dinner, okay, we're going to dedicate this dinner to Eros, right? The god of love. And so we're just going to go around the table and everyone's going to give a speech. And Socrates, you're going to go last because you're going to be the best. And we all know it. So they all go around the room and give their speech. And so it comes time for Socrates. And one of the things he talks about is that this idea, I don't know how familiar you are with this idea of as above, so below, right? Meaning that things are the same on different planes. We see that introverts and extroverts, they both have to deal with the same things, but these things manifest completely differently on both of these planes, right? And so you have the physical plane in which there was this blue entity who was having sex with me, right? And there was a child that would result from that, presumably. But it goes much deeper than that. Because something that Plato wrote about was about love, was that, there are different types of love. And when we talk about love, we're also talking about creation, right? Because love in the physical form obviously would mean sex. And so you're creating a child, right? But something that he said about the woman that taught him about love said that something to the effect that, there are two types of men. There are men who will lie with a woman and create a child, and there are men who will not, and they'll create other things, like mental ideas, like grace and virtue. And so on one level, right, this blue entity is having sex with me in this room, but there's this whole deeper level where this is an allegory for creation, mental creation, pushing the mind to these extremes and overcoming things, right? And so there's this multi-layered experience that is happening there. And one is happening on the physical plane, the other one is happening on the mental plane, right? I can either be devastated by this, or on the mental plane and kind of think of it as a very physical thing. It was a rape. Or I can recognize it as a type of beginning to this whole initiatory experience, right? Where it's about creation and creating a mental idea. And I think, I talked about the birth of Athena and about how she sprang from Zeus's head because he's giving birth to an idea, and people look at that and they're like, well, how weird. He had one of his children out of his head. That doesn't make much sense. But that's the idea that they were trying to convey, is that both of those things are creativity, but they're happening on two different planes of existence, the mental plane and the physical, right? And they're different, just like introverts and extroverts. They're different planes.
But why do you think this encounter couldn't have been consensual? In other words, hey, I'm here. I'm this evolved spiritual being. Search your heart. I'm here to offer you something. If you want to take the leap, this could be really great, ultimately, on many levels. Right.
I mean, I don't know. I guess maybe that could be the case. Or, like I said, this has to be something that will force you to take these mental concepts to an extreme. And, when I talk about not projecting, this is also a Buddhist idea, right? Of ridding oneself of attachments. Because when you're not projecting yourself onto some person or something out there, you're not attached to it anymore. There's a different kind of attachment there. You see it for what it is, not as an extension of yourself. And so this is also a Greek idea. Oddly enough, you wouldn't have thought so, but this is one of those truths that comes through in both Buddhism and ancient Greek religion and mythology. So Apollo, right, and Artemis are sisters. And their mother, she had been in great pain in labor when she was going to give birth to them. She couldn't find anywhere to give birth to them. Finally, she finds the island of Delos, right, which is an island that's floating and has no attachments to the earth. And that is the place where she is finally able to give birth to the twins, Apollo and Artemis. And so that's the same idea, right? Is that you're giving birth to this mental idea, and you cannot have these attachments, these mental attachments to things. So she had to find this island that was not attached to the earth in order to give birth to that. And it's the same concept.
Concept of doing the work to pull back any projected shadow archetypes and integrate them into yourself to become complete as an introvert.
Yeah. And the way I like to think about psychology is I think of it as something that's linear, right? And psychology today, they think that there's all these different disorders and there are chemical imbalances in the brain, and that there's not necessarily any relation to any of it. And I don't take that view. I think that anything in the DSM-5, you can envision a line, right? Or a line with two poles on either end of it. And on either end of those poles are extroversion, and as you go inward towards the center, that's introversion. And so you'll find these things in the DSM-5 kind of sprinkled along that line. And that's, that goes back to Robert Moore. He talks about the archetypal shadow of like the warrior, for example, the warrior archetype in the mind. And the two poles of that are, the person who's either doing harm to others or doing self-harm. And those are the two extroverted ends of that pole. And as you head in towards the center, that's the introversion, where you're neither of those things. Right. And so that's why, my next book is going to be all about this stuff. It's, I've got the working title of Master of Animals, which is an ancient motif for this reason, actually. And it always depicts some god or person standing between two animals that they're kind of keeping at bay, right? Either holding them in their hands or kind of pushing them away off to the sides or holding on to them even. But that's the idea of walking this center line where you are neither of these beasts, and we see this iconography today. This is the reason why when you enter a library, there's two lions at the front door, right? Because you walking between them are kind of like you're the physical manifestation of the master of animals, right? The person who's walking between the two beasts, where you're neither one of those beasts. And that's what that iconography is all about. That.
So you have 1 foot in the extroverted world and 1 foot in the introverted world. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I'm saying that you're extrovert on either end of the pole. And that as you head in towards the center, that's where you're in that small sliver in the center where you're neither one.
Okay.
Right. In terms of the shadow energy of the archetypes.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense. Does that make any sense?
Well, let's unpack it a little bit. I'm not sure I totally get it. So, on one hand, one lion is the extrovert. There's no internal world. Everybody out there is the problem, right? And they're going to harm somebody. That was one of the examples you gave in the psychiatry manual.
DSM-5, yeah.
Right. And then the other end is what?
So on either end, right, you have the shadows, the two shadow poles. And if we're talking about the warrior energy, you're either doing harm to others or you're doing self-harm.
Right.
Harm to yourself. Either way, you're doing harm. But the more you come in towards the center, you're neither one. You're not doing harm to others, and you're not doing harm to yourself.
Gotcha. So you're talking about I must have dismissed it. So you're talking about the two ways the shadow archetype can manifest. It can manifest externally or it can manifest internally. You beat yourself up or you beat someone else up. I remember I'm just getting into Moore's work, but he has talked about that.
Yeah.
The archetypes, you've talked about them a little bit. That could be, you talked about them a little bit today and a little bit during our last interview. That could be a whole other interview talking about these 4 archetypes that are found in Robert Moore's work based upon Carl Jung's work initially, and he expanded upon that. So I don't think we'll get into that today because we probably could spend another hour on that. But maybe I'll have you back and we'll talk about that. But what you're talking about ultimately is doing the work to not be manifesting this archetype as a shadow archetype, either externally or internally, but integrated into yourself, into that that middle path where you're this integrated. You've integrated all these archetypes.
Yeah, exactly.
So going back to this experience with the blue entity, I think what we can gather from what you've talked about is an experience like this is necessarily going to happen to anyone who wants to have an initiatory experience, but every recipe for an initiatory experience is unique. Your recipe had some of these type of encounters, which ultimately pushed you to a point. I'm curious where. I remember one of the last visitation experiences you described in your bedroom was with the what we've referred to as the creature that kind of looked like a Teletubby. And he was stroking your head, and he said, "Don't be afraid," and you said, "You're not." That was a shift.
Yeah.
I'm curious when that shift happened for you and how that might relate to some of the stuff you went through with the blue entity. At what point were you able to authentically say, "I'm not afraid"? What?
Yeah, I mean, what really, the point that really happened was where I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what was happening. I needed to understand it, right? And I was becoming unhinged, unraveled. My life was falling apart. I wasn't sleeping. So I wasn't, obviously doing well during the day. And it was months of that. And I was like, I still don't, I'm no closer to understanding what is happening to me here, And so I realized that I couldn't keep going like that. I physically couldn't do it. And the night before had been kind of a tipping point for me. I won't get into that, but it was a big tipping point where I just said, screw it. I am done with this. I am so finished with it. Like I am baffled by what is happening here. And it makes no sense to me whatsoever. And so I was like, I give up. I'm done. I don't want to see you guys anymore. I don't want anything to do with this. I'm just done. I can't keep going. And it was that night that I had decided that I, woke up to that kind of familiar feeling of being paralyzed. And I was like, here we go. And I had gone to bed that night so just completely enraged about all of this, that I felt like I had been suckered into something, like, what is this? It's just nonsense. It's stupid. I'm emotional all the time. I'm terrified. I'm and so I said, I'm done. But that night I woke up to that paralysis. And so I was immediately angry, when this started to happen, because it was just like I had told you I didn't want to see you again. And yet here you are. I know you are, because I'm paralyzed, and that's what always happens when you guys are around. So I'm waking up slowly. I start to open my eyes, and there's, as my room is coming into focus, and I'm laying on my right side, and I'm laying towards the doorway, and I see on the edge of my nightstand this head, and there's this little man standing on the other end of my nightstand, and he looked like a yard gnome. And of course, I couldn't really be angry anymore, because I was like, am I really seeing this right now? But anyway, like I'm just looking at him, and he's looking at me, and then he says, "Don't give up, keep going." And then he put me back to sleep. And I had a few choice words for him before I fell asleep, that I kind of thought in my head. So anyway, I wake up the next day, and I think to myself, oh gosh, he must know something I don't know. There's got to be something I'm missing, something I don't understand. And I thought to myself, I have been so emotional about all of this, and just so wrapped up in my own emotion. And that's not who I am. I don't do that. Right. So I realized that I just have to let all that go. Let all of it go. The fear, the emotion, feeling anything at all about the experience. I had to let go of all of it to keep going. Right. And so I did that.
And was I don't know what the right word, the fulcrum or the pivot point around this letting go, the point where you needed to let go, was that because you wanted or needed to understand that
I
guy?
think it had pushed me to the point that if I hadn't done that, I don't know what would have happened. Right? Like I probably would be dead right now if I could not have let go of all of that stuff. So it pushed me to the point that, like I said, an extreme in which I had to let go of that stuff absolutely and completely. And as soon as I did, I recognized it immediately. I had this immediate just kind of moment of clarity where I was like, oh my gosh, because I realized that even though I had done these things, I had not done these things to the extreme extent that was necessary. And so I immediately saw my life as like just this, even though I went about it in a very controlled way, and I was much more in control of myself than probably most people. I still could look back at my life and see it as just like this emotional mess comparatively to the complete letting go of all of it, and so that was my moment of clarity. And that was when everything changed in this experience. And I would say it was from that moment on that it became the building up, right? Because I had been torn down completely. I was gone. There was nothing left. And so now was the building up after that. And that was when everything changed.
So you kind of activated extreme stoicism mode. You didn't know you had.
Right.
But
exactly.
all of a sudden,
I realized that, you know what? I don't have to be afraid. Even if I thought that they were going to come in here and strangle me in the middle of the night, I don't have to be afraid. And so, it was after that I started sleeping with my light off and going to bed at a normal time. And I thought, I don't even care anymore. Whatever this is going to be is what it's going to be. And I don't have any control over it. So I'm not going to worry about it, And that is, I think that's a difficult point for people to get to let go that much. And I know it is because I have initiates that will contact me as they're going through things. And this is what people really get hung up on. And I'm going to say something here that is probably not going to be popular. But there was one initiate that came to me, and he had a dream. He thought it was a dream. And so he called me. I gave him my number because he had contacted me and reached out to me. But he was very distraught. And he was quite possibly suicidal at the time that I spoke to him. But one of the things that happened in this dream at the beginning of his experiences was there was an entity that asked him, "Are you ready to give up everything?" And he said, "What do you mean everything?" And so in his mind's eye, they flashed a photograph of his wife. And they said, "Are you ready to give up everything?" And he said, "Let's do it." And obviously that's not something that's going to be popular, but the thing that you have to understand about a spouse and or like a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whoever you're attracted to is that there is some amount of projection that is happening there. And you have to give up that projection attachment. And people confuse that with love, right? They think that that is love, and that's not love, that's lust is what that is. And people can't tell the difference. But because love is unconditional, right? It just is. And so if you have unconditional love for someone, there's nothing that they could do that would make you stop feeling that way about them. And that's where you have to be with it. You can't have these attachments, these projections of yourself. And that doesn't mean that you stop loving your spouse, right? It just means that you probably, it means that you're going to love them on a much deeper level than you knew was possible, right? Because it would be this unconditional level is where you would be at after that. But that's something that's very difficult for people, and it's difficult for people to accept that.
Yeah. Reminds me of actually really kind of correlates with a dream I had just a couple of days ago. In the dream, my wife was cheating on me, and I was enraged in the dream. So enraged, I was grabbing onto a dresser of clothes and just shaking it and looking at the mirror. And I woke up emotionally affected by it. And I started thinking about, this is something I can look at right now. And I think I had been reading your book and talking about the shadow archetype, or maybe it was Robert Moore's book. But I started working with just looking at that whole scenario. What if she did cheat on me? I'll be going through, and whatever that is that I would be going through, can I start kind of pulling that back right now? Because it exists in me right now, even though she's not cheating on me or whatever. There's some type of unhealthy, like you said, that's not love. That I'm going to fly into a rage and there's like a codependence thing. If my wife feels that she needs to sleep with another man, ultimately, the path I don't want to follow is to try to control her. Ultimately, I want her to be free to do whatever she needs to do in her life, to follow her life's path. And if that means that it's without me, that's okay. And if I don't feel okay with that, when that's something I can look at, like, why wouldn't I be okay emotionally if that's what she needed to do? So, but anyway, I think that's something that does come up, as you said, in the process of letting go of attachments. It can come up in dreams. You don't necessarily have to go through it in waking life, where you say, "Hey, honey, the entity in my dream told me I need to let you go, so we're through." You can probably, pay attention to stuff that's maybe something you're getting triggered with in the relationship, and use some type of a process like Stoicism to pull it back, or look at what's coming up in your dream life to gives you something to work with.
I just something I want to add to that. I was talking to someone who had been actively working on Stoicism in his life, right? And he viewed this as kind of like self-improvement. And one of the questions he posed to me was, my wife told me that she hates that I'm doing this. Why? And he said, why would she hate that I'm doing this? And I said, well, you're getting rid of that handle on your back, right? And that handle for her has been something that she could always grab and move you with, right? And so when you've gotten rid of that handle, it changes the dynamic of the relationship there. Right. And so that's why she hates it, because she can't manipulate you in the same way that she could before. And to her, that's scary. Right.
Because she has to change too, to be
right. Right. Exactly.
Reshuffling.
Yeah. And people don't like that. They don't like change. But if I could recommend anything about wanting to get into this stuff, it's step outside your comfort zone. Or in fact, you shouldn't have a comfort zone. Just do things that make you uncomfortable. You know, do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do. I mean, that's how you experience life. That's how you make up your mind about things. I mean, just have no comfort zone. That would be my recommendation to people.
Right.
Don't get too comfortable anywhere.
Yeah. If you're comfortable all the time, you're probably not growing, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. Because that is the most important thing, is that you have to look for growth in everything, in every experience, in every instance in your life of anything that happens. And I would do that. I did that all the time. It could be some small encounter I have with someone where maybe they got snotty with me, or I got snotty with them even. And I would sit and think about that and kind of pick it apart, and why was I affected in that way? Why do I care? Why should I have been that affected? Or do I not like that? That you need to make up your mind about these things, make up your mind about how you're going to feel about things. So it's good to explore stuff like that. And I think that dreams also can point things out to us, right? Like maybe in your situation, maybe you have a little bit of unhealthiness happening there. And so that's, you need to deal with that and think about it and chew on it, and think about what it is that you're not comfortable with there, and why, and, pay attention.
Yeah.
It's always good to pay attention. A lot of people think dreams are just nothing. And that's not the case at all.
Right. They're a direct main line to stuff we're not conscious of, to the subconscious.
Yes.
We can be directly guided. I'm going to go ahead and wrap our interview up for now, but before I do, I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. So, number one, you had this transcendent experience where for 3 months or so you felt one with everything. You could perceive what could be called universal forces flying around, banging into people, but they were just kind of flowing through you, or you weren't affected by them. You at times exhibited what could be considered superhuman abilities, and gradually this extreme state of what you could call enlightenment or nirvana, many words for it, subdued to some sort of a more normal level. But I'm curious, if we look at Matthew Roberts aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt when these UAP videos were first filmed, and we look at Matthew Roberts now, what would you say would be the primary things that have changed for you and your consciousness as a result of going through this initiatory process? How are things different for you now, consciousness wise?
I think things are different for me now in that I kind of understand the psychology of it. And so maybe I can, I think the difference is that I can articulate things more clearly, perhaps than I could before. Outwardly, I don't think anyone would notice any difference because I can't tell you how many people always told me that, they thought of me as the most level-headed person in any room, and I was always a person of very few words, but when I did speak, people listened, and I think that that's even more so the case today. Especially when I talk about some of the psychological stuff, and I'm giving people advice about how to think about things and put them together. So I think that would be the big difference, is just that I'm much better about articulating these kind of inner qualities and what they mean than I was before. Before it was just kind of mental concepts that I kind of used to guide myself, but now I can articulate those and put them out there as advice to others, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Do you the period you went through where you felt this extreme connection to everything, you were kind of in the flow? Do you ever touch into that at all, or do you think that that's something that is that something you strive or are open to connecting to again? Is that like another initiatory process that you need to go to perhaps integrate that on a more consistent basis in your life?
I generally try to revisit that every year. Every season, I try to kind of put myself in that mindset once again and kind of go through it again. If that makes any sense. I mean, I think it's crazy. Yeah, I think it's crazy that you can do that. First of all, that you can revisit it. And it's not something that once you're disconnected from it, it's gone forever. That's not the case. I think as long as you are putting in the work and the effort, the universe is conscious and it will recognize that work and effort and reward it. And that's why I think a lot too with this initiatory experience, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. Right. And in my case, I put a lot into it. I was someone who was constantly watching the news. I turned off my TV. I did not turn it on the entire time this was happening. And so I would come home from work and I would crack open a William Walker Atkinson book or a book by Mabel Collins to try and just figure out what was going on, and so I read a lot. And so I was putting in the work. I really wanted to get to the bottom of this. And if you concentrate all of your effort on it, I think your outcome, you'll have a better chance of a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you is, it seems that these different visitations you had with different entities was a means to an end, and that it escalated things for you emotionally and mentally to the point where you had to let it all go, and that was kind of what pushed you through to the other end of this initiatory experience. Now that you've gone through this, are you still getting visitations at all, or are those kind of subsided because they've served their purpose?
I still see things now and again. I don't know what that means. I still, I kind of look at it and I try to unpack it a little bit. Like there was just a couple of months ago, I was asleep in my room And I opened my eyes and I saw that there was someone standing there over me. But then it just kind of, it was just like a shadow, and it just kind of evaporated, you know? So I'll see things like that. And I don't know what that is. Maybe they're checking up on me medically. I don't know, but certainly there's nothing scary. That didn't scare me. You know, I was just like, oh, they're still doing things. You know, I mean, I feel like if you're someone who is continuing to have intense experiences, it's because you're not done yet. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, there are a lot of people out there who, you know, claim all kinds of things, that they're in touch with the Galactic Federation or whatever nonsense, and they have these ongoing, continuing experiences. And I kind of look at that and I say, I kind of feel like you're just not finished with initiation yet. And maybe this idea that you are some kind of ambassador to the Galactic Federation is your ego talking, you know, because you're really not that, if that makes any sense.
Well, I'm certainly skeptical of a lot of channeled work. I doubt most of it that I see doesn't resonate with me. So it's easy for me to imagine that some people are just working from an inflated ego, or is inflated. What would Robert Moore call it? The inflated shadow magician archetype or something?
Yeah. And he described it as like, it's kind of like the cartoon person that can't get off the air hose, right? That they're on the air hose and they just blow up like a balloon and float away. And that's what they do. And you know, and you see that in these UFO circles where, you know, people claim to be channeling all kinds of things. I will say that I do like the law of one material. I don't know it that well, but what I have heard of it and kind of the things that I have heard, it seems to be pretty accurate. And that is probably one of the few, you know, because I've also heard people online talking all kinds. There was one I heard about how this girl claimed that she had healed the entire reptilian race, and I was just like, I was like, I don't think so. You know, she was talking about how they traveled millions of miles and they've been waiting millions of years for someone to heal them, and I finally did it. And I was like, yeah,
good
sure.
For you. Good for you. Now what?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, Matthew, it's been a great discussion. I feel like, at least for me, we went really deep. Part of this discussion is really just me really wanting to deeply understand the inner workings of the experience that you went through and apply it to my own life, and hopefully help others to take what resonates with them to apply to their life, and of course to really understand more about what's really happening with the UAP/UFO phenomenon. And I think that this inner part, the spiritual, psychological, initiatory part, is a super interesting perspective, and it's great to hear from someone like yourself who has firsthand knowledge of it. So thanks again. I look forward to having you back when your new book's out at the very latest to talk more about that.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I'll come back at any time you want.
Great.
Thank you for having me.